Hi folks, this is Mr. Weston here, and this is the Final Fantasy trading card game complete Opus 1 review. Now this is part 3 where we'll be taking a look at the wind cards that are in Opus 1. If you want to see what's in the fire and the ice categories, please check out my previous videos. So let's get started. We are going to take a look at Alexander. So this is the surprising choice for a first card that you get. So of course, majority of the cards that some of the cards you've seen so far cost 5 or more. So pretty much, if once Alexander is summoned, you choose a forward of cost 5 or more, you break it, you put it into the break zone. Easy enough. Next up, we have Valifor from Final Fantasy X. Pretty much all the forwards that are out, including yours, pretty much return to their opponent owner's hand. So if you're lucky enough to have some low cost forwards and your opponent has some high cost forwards, use this card. They'll be paying those costs all over again. There we go. Next up, we have Van from Final Fantasy XII, but this is of course Dissidia Final Fantasy version. So of course, when he does enter the field, you can play one wind forward of cost 3 or less from your hand onto the field. I'll show some of those off in a minute. And of course, when he attacks, you can choose up to 2 backups you control and activate them. So essentially, if they were dull, you can pretty much activate them again. Pretty much swing them back again. So if they're on the side like so, you swing them back up, which can be enough to bring out some more forwards or some more backups. And speaking of backups, next we have Aerith. This is her 3 cost one, so of course when she does enter the field, if you manage to have 3 backups already and they're dull, if she comes onto the field, you can pretty much swing them back again. And it's a nice little ability that she has as well. You discard a copy of Aerith and you dull this one, activate all the forwards you controlled, so if they've attacked, they cannot be chosen by your summons, or they can also not be chosen by summons or abilities that turn as well. And speaking of Aerith, we have 2 cost Aerith. So essentially when she does enter the field, you only choose 1 backup you control other than Aerith and activate it. So that's not too bad, but I reckon the 3 cost one is significantly better than this one. But it does have to have her as well, so you can use Planet Protector a couple of times. Next up we have Dancer from Final Fantasy Tactics. Pretty much when you dull this card, you do 1,000 damage to all the forwards your opponent controls. So say if you would have a card that pretty much can do damage to a damaged card, this is where Dancer can come in. So you pretty much all you do is just dull it, and you deal 1,000 damage to all the forwards your opponent controls. Next up, we have Onion Knight. Now, this is the ninja version from Dissidia Final Fantasy. So when he enters the field, you choose 1 backup you control and activate it. So say if you were to have summon Onion Knight and you have a dull Aerith, you can pretty much activate her again. Not too bad. Next up, we have Evoker. Now, like the other 1 cost backups you have, this one is pretty much just a filler until you can get some better ones. A majority of these are in fact in the starter decks, in fact. So I would get rid of those as soon as you're able to. Sorry. Now, next up we have Thief version 1. Now, this is of course the forward version from Final Fantasy III. So when he enters the field, your opponent puts the top card of his or her deck into the break zone, which is thankfully good if that card is an EX burst and they do damage. So this is not too bad to have. Next up, we have the backup version of Thief. This is pretty much the same effect. The only difference is, of course, it is a backup version rather than a forward version. Next up, we have Zidane from Final Fantasy IX, Dissidia Final Fantasy, and this is the Dissidia Final Fantasy version. So of course he's from Final Fantasy IX. This is probably much a pretty useful card to have if you're lucky enough to have 3 of these. He cannot be chosen by your opponent's summons abilities, and he cannot be blocked by a forward of cost 4 or more as well. So say if you were to have Van if Van was on your opponent's side of the field, as was Onion Knight, they cannot target Zidane to attack. Even though he has only a 3000 power, that's not too bad. Is pretty much just be there to do damage to your opponent, and by that I mean have your opponent discard a card, put the top card on their card into the breaks to the damage zone. So nice to have. Next up we have Sid from Final Fantasy VII. Now this is of course the 4-cost Sid. Again, more on that later. Pretty much his ability is not too bad actually if you want to have your opponent pretty much remove a lot of cards from their hand, from their deck. So of course when the forward that took damage from Sid Highwind is put from the field into break zone on the same turn, your opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her deck into the break zone. And of course if you use Highwind, which is discarding a copy of him and dulling it, your opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her deck into the break zone. So nice. And next up, we have 2-cost Zid from Final Fantasy VII. So if you took, when their forward took damage from Zid, puts one field in the break zone on the same turn, it's pretty much the same effect as the 4-cost Zid. The only difference is it does not have Highwind on it. So it's a bit of a debate to actually have this version as well as the other version. I would probably keep both. If you want to mitigate your opponent's deck, I would keep both versions just so you can use Highwind more often. Next up, we have Sylph from Final Fantasy Tactics. So if you choose a forward and activate it, so essentially if all your opponent cards have attacked, like for example, we'll use Sid Highwind, the 4-cost for example. Pretty much his ability is to discard a copy of himself and dull. You can activate it again, potentially use it again, and he also gains 1000 power to the end of the turn. Nice. Next up we have Chocobo from Final Fantasy VII. Now this one is a 3-cost and has haste, so essentially you can pretty much attack straight away. So of course when Chocobo also forms a party, now this is pretty much something I haven't covered. So a party is either 2 or more cards of the same element can combine together and attack, and their damage that you have on the bottom here is combined. So if you have 2 Chocobos, they can combine and do 8,000, but this one also has the ability to do 3,000 power on both cards until the end of turn. So rather than 8,000, it will be 2 cards with 4,000 power to do 8,000. It's 2 cards doing 7,000 for a total of 14. Nice. Next up, you also have the 1-cost Chocobo from Final Fantasy VII. This one is pretty much just good to have as well, even though it's the same ability with slightly less power. So of course, you have both of these rather than doing have 2 cards doing 6,000 damage. You have both of these cards doing 10,000. Not too bad. But of course, the other one is much better. So to move around a bit. Next up is Devout from Final Fantasy III. So of course when Devout enters the field, choose 1 forward, of course 2 or less from the break zone, and play it onto the field. I'm not 100% sure if this is better than the last Devout. Bear with me for a moment. So back again, and the answer is sadly a resounding no. But admittedly, if you do have a wind deck, I would probably keep it in just in case, especially when there's a couple of 2-cost that you could have from your break zone onto the field. So I would potentially keep these just in case, but otherwise I'm not 100% sure. Bear with me for a moment. So just a slight pause there. I had to double check all of my cards. Next up we have Ninja from Final Fantasy III. So essentially you pay a ice, you discard a wind, discard 1 card from your hand, choose a forward and deal 2,000 damage. So, and this one you don't dull it, so you can also attack it as well. So that can be useful, but I'm not 100% sure, but that's alright. Next up we have Nora from Final Fantasy XIII. So this is of course Hope's mother. When she enters the field, you may search for 1 card Hope and add it to your hand. I think we haven't shown off Hope yet, but I think we'll be showing that off at some point. Next up, we have Bart. Now, this one is, of course, from Dissidia Final Fantasy, and this is and he, of course, is character 5. So when Bart enters the field, Bart enters the field, activate all the wind characters you can control. So if you pretty much have all these wind characters that you have there, and you pretty much dull them all, bring on, and they're activated again. Next up, we have another Dissidia Final Fantasy version of Bart. Now, this one has the weird ability of Bart has all the jobs. I will explain this a little bit later on, but so far, can be useful if you do have cards that can use this ability. And speaking of Nora, we bring out Hope from Final Fantasy 13. So this is a forward version. When Hope enters the field, choose one backup you can control and activate it. But if you have casted Alexander, for example, you activate all the backups you can control instead. Considering there's only one version of Alexander, that's kind of okay. But again, when you enter the field, you can activate all the backups you control. So there you go. Now next up, probably one of my favourite cards, Maria from Final Fantasy II. Now you will notice one particular ability that's probably present on some of the cards I've shown you, which is the forwards you can control gain 1,000 power. This one is completely different, because rather than restricting it to a certain element, this one uses it for all forwards you control. So I would probably keep this in here if you do have a wind deck and another element. Next up, we have the old Shotola. I do not know how to pronounce this card. Now, she's also from the City of Final Fantasy, but of course, this is 14. 14? Yeah, 14. Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. I'm losing it on the Roman numerals at the moment. So pretty much, she has a couple of nice abilities. So you can pretty much dull a wind backup, to do 1,000 damage to a forward, or you can dull her and deal 2,000 damage instead. So there you are. Now, next up, we have Yuffie from Final Fantasy VII. Well, not surprising that she's a ninja, she would also be the wind element. Going on to that ninja previously. So, she cannot be blocked by a forward of cost 4 or more. So, pretty much, she's the higher cost of Zidane. But, of course, she also has the ability Bloodfest. So, you can choose up to 3 forwards to fire 6,000 damage among them as you like. Unit must be 1,000 power. So, essentially, you could do 2,000 damage to each of your opponents, or you can pretty much just do 6,000 to even one of them. I believe that's correct. I'm not 100% sure. I've not really used that ability. But, of course, we can't have a 3 cost without a 1 cost Yuffie. So this one's slightly different. I say slightly different, but this one, of course, cannot be blocked by a forward of cost 3 or more. So rather than a cost 4, she's now can cost 3. So, especially when she's a 1 cost. So that's kind of okay. Next up, we have Archer from Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, of course, this is a female version. 3,000 power with first strike. Kind of okay. I mean, especially when I've shown you Red 13 that does have, that's 2 cost, 5,000 power, and also has first strike. So, this might be questionable to have. But, again, if you're running a wind deck, it is nice to have this card here. Next up, we have Archer. Now, this is the male version of Archer. So, essentially, you pretty much pay 2 wind, dull him, and you discard the card. Choose 1 backup of cost 3 or less, and break it. So, say if you were to have, say, Nora on the side of the field, which he pretty much comes in, you can pretty much break her. And by that, I mean put her into the break zone. Next up, we have Riku from Final Fantasy X. So, essentially, her abilities allow her to pretty much take a lot of cards from your opponent and put them into the break zone. So your opponent will put 1 card from the top of his or her deck into the break zone. And if she has Mug, if you use Mug, so you pay her, pay a wind, and dull the card, your opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her deck into the rake zone, and you draw a card. So that can be handy. Actually, probably is handy. I have lost to her before. And of course, we have another Riku, this one also from Final Fantasy X. When Riku enters the field, choose up to 5 backups you can control, and return them to their owner's hands. So I believe you can choose 5 backups, and then you have... I think that pretty much allows you to take backups from another opponent, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't really used this card yet, so I can't say if it will be useful or not. And there you have it, all the wind cards from Opus 1. Not excluding starter cards, but that will come back later. So there you go. Stick around, we do have a few more cards to show off. This is Mr. Weston. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.